They were thrown off the base like vagrants, and 48 hours later, those vagrants were the reason Americans were still breathing. Picture it, November 1966, somewhere in the Vietnamese highlands where the jungle doesn't end, it just tightens. A US Firebase sat on a scraped-out hilltop like a coin pressed into mud. Sandbags, concertina wire, a few bunkers with hand-painted signs, a flag snapping in wet heat, and a general who treated that hill like a stage, because the Pentagon was coming. A VIP visit, a parade of polished boots and clean collars, a living photograph for the brass back in Saigon. General Cranston wanted everything perfect. Crates stacked straight, helmets lined up, latrines scrubbed, men shaved so close their faces looked raw. War could wait, appearances could not. Then the helicopter arrived. A Huey thumped down into the landing zone, and the dust rose in a brown halo. The door slid open, and 4 Allied soldiers stepped out. They did not look like allies. They looked like something the jungle had spat out after chewing for weeks. Their uniforms were torn and stained darker than sweat. Their faces were smeared with old camouflage and newer grime. Their webbing hung crooked, patched with cord and tape. Their boots were the wrong color from river mud. One of them carried a weapon that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. And the smell, God, the smell, hit the landing zone like a slap. Rot, fish sauce, wet canvas, and the sour stench of men who'd been living inside the forest instead of visiting it. The general didn't see operators, he saw embarrassment. He walked right up with that stiff-backed confidence that comes from knowing your stars will outrank any argument. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You come onto my base looking like tramps?" The leader of the 4, Sergeant Thompson, Australian SAS, didn't flinch. His eyes were calm, too calm. The kind of calm you see in men who've already made their peace with death and learned how to weaponize the minutes in between. "We've been out," Thompson said. Simple as that. Cranston looked him up and down like a man inspecting a cracked mirror. He turned to an aide, lips thin. "Get them off my Firebase," he ordered. "Now. I won't have them walking around when the Pentagon delegation arrives. It makes us look undisciplined." The words landed like a boot to the ribs. Thompson's team, Davies, Jenkins, Morris, stood there in silence. If they felt insult, they didn't show it. Not because they didn't care, because they cared too much to waste energy on pride. The general waved a hand like he was shooing flies. A few American soldiers watched with that awkward half smile you wear when someone else is getting humiliated and you're grateful it isn't you. And just like that, 4 men who'd spent weeks hunting in the jungle were escorted back to the helicopter and sent away from the hill. If this were a normal story, that's where it would end. Bruised egos, paperwork, a bitter joke told later over warm beer. Protocol demanded it, common sense demanded it. Military doctrine screamed, don't get involved in fights that aren't yours. But as the Huey lifted off and banked away from Cranston's spotless landing zone, Thompson leaned forward in his canvas seat and tapped the pilot, a warrant officer named Mackenzie, on the shoulder. Then he pointed down, not at the route home, at a patch of jungle 3 kilometers northeast of the American base. Mackenzie glanced at his map and frowned. That square was marked green, pacified, cleared, safe enough for convoys, safe enough for staff officers to sleep as if the trees were empty. He looked back at Thompson like, "You sure?" Thompson didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. His finger stayed steady. Mackenzie had flown enough insertions to know when a man's instincts were screaming louder than any radio, so he turned the helicopter. Because Thompson wasn't reading the war from an air-conditioned office, he was reading it the way you read a knife in the dark, by the change in the air. From the open door, with the wind hammering his face and the canopy rolling beneath them like a green ocean, Thompson had seen something no green zone should ever have. Not tanks, not columns of soldiers, lines, straight lines, thin, unnatural cuts in a world that rarely does straight. Communication cable, half hidden under leaves and mud, laid with purpose. The kind that linked observation posts to mortar pits, the kind that turned scattered men into a single coordinated fist. And then, more chilling than the sight, came a smell. At first it was faint, drowned under fuel and wet rot, but it grew sharper as the Huey dipped around a ridge. Rice, not one cook fire, not a family meal, rice in quantity, dozens of fires, smoke trapped beneath layers of canopy, cooking for hundreds, and underneath the rice, that unmistakable fermented salt sting, nok mam, fish sauce, poured by the leader when you're feeding an army. Thompson's blood didn't just run cold, it tightened. Because there were no villages in that grid, intelligence had verified it. Months ago, that area had been stamped safe and forgotten, but Thompson could smell the lie. What he smelled was not a hamlet. What he smelled was a regiment, 2,000 men, maybe more, sitting in the jungle less than 3,000 meters from Cranston's precious hill, with cable in the ground and mortars waiting like loaded lungs. A force gathered in darkness, about to breathe fire, and back on the Firebase, boots were being shined. Thompson looked at his 3 men. Corporal Davies, barely 22, still young enough to believe the war had rules. Jenkins, the radio man, eyes like a metronome, steady even when the world went loud. Morris, weapons specialist, hands that could strip a rifle blindfolded and assemble it again by feel. They all watched Thompson, not asking out loud because the helicopter noise would swallow it anyway, but their eyes said it clear. Are we going home? Or are we doing something stupid and legendary? Thompson made the decision in the time it takes to swallow. He jabbed the map, grid square, downward motion. Put us in, he told Mackenzie. Unauthorized. Insane. A career-ending choice on paper. Mackenzie's eyebrows rose. Then he banked hard and dropped altitude with the kind of sharp confidence that only comes from men who've survived the consequences of hesitation. He didn't land. Landing meant dying. He hovered low, skids half a meter above elephant grass, rotor wash flattening the clearing into a storm of green. The 4 SAS men rolled out like they'd been poured from the aircraft. Weapons up, knees bent, eyes scanning. 30 seconds. Then the Huey clawed into the sky and vanished, leaving them alone with the jungle and whatever was staging inside it. And the strangest part, the moment they touched the tree line, they disappeared. Not metaphorically, not poetically, physically. 1 second, 4 figures in tiger stripe moving toward the foliage. Next, nothing. As if the jungle had decided it owned them. Thompson led with the smooth, slow economy of a predator. No snapping twigs, no brushing leaves. His feet rolled from heel to toe like he was walking on glass. They moved in a rhythm the jungle couldn't distinguish. Advance on bird call, freeze on silence, glide on wind. It wasn't speed, it was patience sharpened into a blade. 47 minutes after insertion, Thompson raised his fist. Halt. They froze instantly. For 2 minutes, they became statues with beating hearts. Then Thompson slid forward alone, inch by inch, and brushed aside leaf litter so gently it wouldn't disturb a spiderweb. There it was. Black rubber-coated cable, thumb-thick, running dead straight through rotting forest floor. Factory-made, not scavenged, not improvised. The nervous system of a real army. Thompson stared at it, and something hardened behind his camouflage paint. Because guerrillas didn't do this. Local cells used runners and whispers. This was NVA, regulars, officers, plans. And Cranston was asleep on a hill like a man who thinks maps can protect him. Thompson's team waited. He didn't need to explain what they were seeing. They'd all smelled the rice, seen the wire, felt the quiet pressure of an unseen mass. But there was still one question hanging heavier than humidity. Why risk yourselves for a general who called you trash? And the answer wasn't strategy, it was debt. Thompson's mind flicked back to March 1966. Operation Silver City, mortar screams, mud, his own leg shredded by shrapnel, the world shaking apart. He remembered lying helpless, enemy tracers cutting the air like green needles, thinking, this is where it ends. Then a man appeared through the chaos. American fatigues, face young enough to still look like home. Doc Miller from Ohio. Miller sprinted into the fire anyway, dragged Thompson through mud, shielded him with his own body, worked with the calm precision of a medic who refuses to let panic exist. Miller saved Thompson's life. Then as the landing zone came into view, a single bullet found the gap in Miller's flak jacket. Miller went home under a flag. Thompson went home with a scar and a debt that never stopped ticking. So when he looked at the wire in the dirt, he wasn't thinking of General Cranston's arrogance, he was thinking of the uniform Doc Miller died wearing. The Americans on that hill were family, even the kind of family that slams the door in your face. And in the jungle, you don't let family die just to prove a point. Thompson tapped the scar on his leg. Davies swallowed. Jenkins nodded once. Morris tightened his grip on his weapon. Decision made. No speeches. As the sun fell, the jungle changed. It always did. Daylight in Vietnam was oppressive. Night was worse. Night turned the forest into a living labyrinth designed to break human minds. For the NVA regiment below, darkness was cover. For Thompson and his men, darkness was territory. The Viet Cong had a name for what hunted like this, moved like this, left no footprints and no mercy. Ma Rang, jungle ghost. The first target was a forward observation post. 2 soldiers in a spider hole, field telephone at their knees, eyes fixed on the trail. Disciplined, alert, watching the wrong direction. The threat didn't come from the trail, it came from behind their ribs. Thompson slid in like a shadow gaining weight. A hand sealed over one man's mouth. A blade did the rest. 4 seconds later, the second soldier turned. Too late. No gunshots, no shouting. Just the soft collapse of bodies returning to dirt. Then Thompson did something that wasn't necessary for killing, but was perfect for fear. They propped the bodies against a tree, eyes open, mouth slack, as if the jungle itself had posed them. And Thompson took a single playing card from his pocket, Ace of Spades. To a civilian, it's nothing. In Vietnam's superstition-soaked darkness, it's a death omen. He slid it between the dead sentry's teeth like a signature. A message. We were here, we touched you, we can touch anyone. They melted away. Next, a mortar pit on the flank. Crew stacking shells, smoking, laughing in low voices, safe in the belief that an entire regiment around them meant protection. 4 figures rose out of elephant grass like smoke. Knives, garrots, rifle butts, silent work. Another ace appeared, resting on an ammunition crate like a curse. Then Jenkins found the cable network Thompson had spotted from the air. Instead of cutting it, too obvious, he tapped it. An induction clamp, a stolen handset, and then he did the most dangerous thing of all. He whispered into the enemy's nervous system. Not English, Vietnamese. Marang, he breathed. Marang, the jungle ghost. Click. A minute later, another line. They're inside the perimeter. Click. He didn't need perfect grammar, he needed a spark. Because fear in an army camp at night spreads faster than malaria. The scream came when the relief shift found the observation post. A raw sound, pure animal terror. Then the whispers started running tent to tent. Not Americans, ghosts, not bullets, curses. Men began firing at shadows. Tracers stitched bamboo. Officers shouted for order, but their voices had a hairline crack of uncertainty, and that crack widened. Thompson watched from the trees, heart pounding, hands steady. It was working. But he knew fear alone wouldn't stop a regiment. It would make them hesitate. It would make them jumpy. It wouldn't make them blind. To stop the assault, Thompson needed to cut out the eyes and voice of the operation. He needed the head of the snake. The command post sat deeper in the depression. Tents and bunkers, radios, maps, officers speaking in tense bursts. The most guarded point in the whole staging area. Suicide to approach. So Thompson approached. They crawled forward inch by inch. Mud soaking through cloth. Insects biting. Sweat stinging eyes. Close enough now to hear an officer arguing over a timeline. They didn't know the problem was 4 filthy men lying 50 meters away. Thompson signaled Morris. Distraction. Morris pulled out a device. Delay fuse noise simulator built to mimic heavy machine gun fire. Not to kill, to lie. He lobbed it into vegetation opposite the command post. 10 seconds. Thompson counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The jungle exploded with the roaring staccato of an M60. Instant chaos. Guards spun and fired into darkness. Officers screamed contradictory orders. Security details turned their backs toward the phantom attack, and that was the only opening the SAS needed. They surged in, not running, not stomping, moving with that terrifying silent speed that feels impossible until you see men trained to do it. Inside the perimeter, before anyone understood the threat was behind them, no gunshots, no panic cries, just sudden hands, sudden pressure, sudden collapse. A guard's windpipe crushed, a signal officer folded with a blade in his kidney, radios cut, map tables slashed, orders lost mid-sentence. And on the main tactical map, right over the grid that marked General Cranston's Firebase, Thompson pinned an Ace of Spades with his knife. The message was obscene in its simplicity. We are in your house. We see your plan. You can't stop us. Then they vanished back into the chaos, like smoke slipping through fingers. The enemy camp turned inward, firing at itself, yelling into dead radios, tearing apart the very coordination they'd built. The assault plan dissolved into a frantic defense against an enemy they could not count, could not see, could not understand. But Thompson knew the night wasn't done, because as he pulled back toward the American hill, he saw something that made his stomach drop. From the southern edge of the Firebase, near the trash dump, there was a faint rhythmic blink. Not a flashlight, a code. Someone inside the wire was talking to the jungle, a traitor. The NVA didn't just have soldiers in the trees, they had eyes inside the fortress. Thompson didn't debate, he didn't confer. He split his team, 3 men to establish an ambush line along the likely avenue of approach. He went alone toward the base. 12 hours earlier, he'd been kicked out the front gate. Now he came back in through garbage. He crawled through rotting food, broken crates, stinking refuse, masking himself in filth until even the rats would have looked away. Near the incinerator, a figure crouched in shadow. Not an American soldier, a Vietnamese interpreter wearing a Chiu Hoi armband, the defector program the Americans loved to parade for visiting dignitaries. The general trusted men like this, showpiece allies, but Thompson knew it was also the perfect disguise. The interpreter wasn't using a radio. He was setting up modified trip flares in a tight cluster, angled not outward as warning, but upward like signal rockets, target markers. When the assault began, those flares would arc and burn above Cranston's command bunker, an aiming point for heavy mortars waiting out there in the trees. Decapitation in the first volley. Thompson waited until the man's hand touched the trigger mechanism. Then he moved. He didn't raise a gun. He rose out of the trash pile like something dragged from a swamp, covered in slime and fury. The struggle was short, brutal, muffled, a gasp, a choke. Then the interpreter sagged into the mud. Thompson bound him, dragged him into shadow. But he wasn't done. Because the enemy was waiting for that signal. If they didn't get it, they might abort, or switch to something worse. So Thompson re-aimed the flares, not at the bunker, at an empty swamp 2 kilometers west. Then he set the timer. You want a marker? Fine, I'll give you one. He slipped back into the jungle to rejoin his team. And at 2 a.m., the witching hour arrived. Inside the Firebase, General Cranston slept with his uniform pressed for morning inspection. Sentries walked bored loops. Then the sky tore open. Distant thumps, mortars firing, hundreds of rounds in the air at once. The NVA regimental assault launched, desperate to regain control after the night's unraveling. Their commanders watched for the internal signal, and there it was. A cluster of red flares burst into life, arcing into the sky, but they drifted west, over swamp, not over the base. Mortar crews trained to obey markers like scripture, adjusted their tubes and poured fire onto empty mud. For 20 minutes, the swamp was pulverized, trees shredded, earth churned into boiling craters. Inside the Firebase, men stared at the distant explosions in confusion. Cranston stumbled from his quarters half-dressed, blinking at the horizon like a man watching someone else's nightmare. He thought thought the enemy had made a navigation error. He didn't realize he was watching his own execution get thrown aside by the tramp he'd insulted. But even without accurate mortars, the infantry assault still came. 2 battalions, nearly 1,000 men, rose from the tree line and surged toward the wire, convinced the path had been cut. Their sappers were supposed to open lanes. Their engineers were supposed to neutralize mines. They ran forward shouting, believing in the plan. They ran into a wall, because the sapper teams were already dead, lying in grass with wire cutters still in hand. Thompson's patrol had found them earlier, quietly removed them one by one. The wire was intact. The claymores were armed. When the first wave hit the perimeter, Americans triggered the mines. A sheet of flame and steel ripped the darkness open. Men fell like grass cut by a scythe. The second wave stalled, blind, screaming, looking for gaps that didn't exist. Machine guns found them. Flares lit their confusion. The assault collapsed into a slaughter. From the trees, Thompson watched it break. A complex regimental operation dismantled by 4 men with knives, whispers, and the cruelty of understanding how fear turns soldiers into strangers. Inside the base, Cranston barked orders and watched the enemy retreat. He smiled. In his head, this victory belonged to discipline, to shining boots, to regulations. He told his aide the enemy lacked professionalism. He had no idea the incompetence he was witnessing had been engineered in mud by men he'd called garbage. The attack ended in under an hour. By sunrise, the jungle beyond the wire was littered with dead, and the Americans were celebrating a clean defensive win. And that's when war delivered its joke, the kind that isn't funny until it ruins your life. Because the SAS team, exhausted and intact, began to slip away toward their extraction zone. No unnecessary shots fired, no trophies taken, just the quiet satisfaction of doing the impossible. They were 3 kilometers from safety when the horizon behind them flashed with new light. Not enemy fire, American fire. Standard procedure, approved by protocol. Prophylactic artillery, the celebratory plowing of jungle grids to punish retreating attackers. 105mm howitzers began methodically hammering coordinates. Coordinates that did not include the fact that 4 Australians were moving through one of those squares. You can dodge a rifle. You can't dodge a map. The first shell burst in the treetops, showering them with splintered branches and metal. They hit the dirt. The next impact landed closer. Too close. A heavy, high-explosive round detonated near the rear of the file. Private Cole, the youngest, the one who'd been writing letters home like the war was something you could explain. He took the full force. It was instant. A cruel, clean theft. Cole had walked through an enemy regiment unharmed. He was killed by the people he'd saved. For a moment, even the veterans froze. Because irony like that doesn't feel human. It feels like the jungle itself laughing. They carried him deeper into the trees, teeth clenched so hard their jaws hurt, rage swallowed because there was no one to punch. Back at the Firebase, a mood of triumph reigned. General Cranston emerged impeccably shaved, shining in the sunrise, ready to inspect the battlefield and count bodies for the report. Photographers adjusted cameras, aides drafted victory summaries. Then Cranston walked beyond the wire, and his smile started to die. Because he didn't find what his narrative required. He found sapper bodies with throats cut. He found men dead in positions that didn't match claymore patterns. And beside them, white against dirty ground, he found playing cards, Ace of Spades, one, then another, then another. Cold sweat slid down his spine as the truth assembled itself, piece by piece, like a weapon being loaded. His radio operator approached with a pale face and handed him a coded message from Australian headquarters. An unofficial report, carefully worded, but impossible to misread. An Australian soldier was dead in a sector adjacent to the American base. Time of casualty, the exact window when Cranston's guns had opened that prophylactic barrage. Cranston stared toward the distant jungle where smoke still rose. And in that moment, the general finally understood what he had done. The filthy tramps hadn't left. They'd stayed. They'd fought for him. And he had repaid them with a shell. The military machine, of course, did what it always does. It swallowed the truth. In the days that followed, silence descended. Not the peaceful kind, but the bureaucratic kind. Forms, stamps, and carefully constructed lies. Official reports described the battle as a brilliant American defensive operation. The Australian patrol's role disappeared into footnotes that were never written. Private Cole's death was blamed on an accident far from the front. Anything to avoid admitting friendly fire near a general with a Pentagon audience. Heroes erased, ghosts filed away. Years later, men like Colonel David Hackworth would dig through archives and point to actions like these as proof of what should have been done. Stealth, intelligence, psychological warfare instead of brute force optimism. But paper cannot resurrect a boy, and it can't scrub guilt off a man's hands. The final note of this story didn't sound until decades later, mid-1990s. General Cranston, long retired, living comfortably in the suburbs of Washington, died with a respectable legacy and clean lawns. His family sorted through his possessions. In a heavy oak desk, in a locked drawer only he had used, they found a small velvet-lined box. Inside was not a medal, not a watch, not a family jewel. Inside was a battered Australian dog tag, darkened with time and jungle damp, engraved with a a single name, Cole, and beside it, yellowed with age, a single playing card, Ace of Spades. His family didn't understand why a high-ranking American general had kept such strange relics like sacred items, but anyone who knew the truth didn't need an explanation. For 30 years, Cranston had lived with that box like a stone in his chest, a private confession, a daily reminder that the men who save you rarely look like heroes when they arrive. Sometimes they look like beggars, sometimes they smell like rotten fish sauce, and sometimes the greatest feats of a war don't end up in textbooks at all. They end up sealed in secret folders, buried under stamps that say top secret, while the real story survives only as a ghost whispered through the jungle. 4 tramps in torn uniforms, a regiment turned inside out, a base saved by a man who was never supposed to be there, and a debt paid in blood that a general carried to his grave.